Crowd, because it's primarily geared towards administrative functions and your people that are really power users for all of your Atlassian tools, is not as robust a UI as the other applications, because it's really, again, kind of that middleware product that's helping you do a lot of management activities. So you're not going to see as much of the bells and whistles as you do in things like, say, Jira or Confluence. Now, as far as the deployment of Crowd is concerned, again, it's a server and data center product. So you would have to stand up, one server for the application itself, and then one server for the database. They do have a data center version for clustering. You would have to have a very, very large clustered instance for that to be necessary. Usually just one server is fine for deploying this. And of course, Crowd would need access at the network level to any of the applications that you actually plan on integrating with, as well as the directories. So things like Active Directory, you would have to be able to talk with that. And then also, Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, Bamboo, any of those tools that you want to make part of this ecosystem would have to reside on the same network. So right now what we have is a demo environment that we've set up. This is out there on AWS, actually. And I've already configured this to work with Jira, Confluence, and Bitbucket. These are all running on the data center versions. And when you first log into Crowd, this is essentially what you see. And of course, you're going to ignore the warnings about being an evaluation version. We just have a demo license out there. And the UI probably looks familiar to Jira. You've got your toolbar options at the top that give you the different consoles that you can go into. And the backbone of all of Crowd is basically directories. So directories actually exist in all the other Atlassian tools today. So if you go into Jira, you'll see there's an internal directory there that your users are all in. If you go into Confluence, there's this same thing. There's a Confluence directory there. And each one sort of exists in its own silo. And you may even have users that exist in both, but they have different email addresses in one, or the usernames are different between the two. And so if you have something like a new user access request, in some cases, depending on how your setup is done, you may have to go into Jira, set them up, and then go into Confluence and set them up, and so on with each of the different applications. And this directories panel is sort of the starting point for coming up with your main user list that could be the basis for access for all of those applications. So here we've basically just come up with a primary directory that's got all the users inside of it. We'll look at the user section here in a little bit. But the other benefit, aside from just having one master directory, is that we can also set up multiple directories with different levels of access. It makes it much easier to do things like mass activation and mass deactivation. So a good example use case for that is, let's say we're doing a big project and we have a consulting group coming in with 10, 15 people. We know they're going to need access to all the Atlassian applications and maybe even Office 365 for 3 or 4 months. But then at the end of that engagement, we need to easily just go ahead and deactivate them all. Well, in this case, I can just set up a directory just for those individuals. And then later on down the road, it'd be very easy to just deactivate it. And then we won't lose any of the audit trail, any of the audit history, but it makes the administrative function much easier. So what I'm going to do is actually just create a new directory called an internal directory. There's several options here. You'll notice including integrating with Azure Active Directory, or if you're connecting to an outside LDAP like Active Directory or some other directory management service that you have installed in the enterprise. There's several options here that they lead into a wizard that makes it much easier to set these things up. But for this example, we'll just stick with a standard internal directory. And so I'm just going to give it an example name. In this case, we'll call it contracting engagement. No need to give it a description. There's several parameters here that we can define. I won't go into each one in great detail because it's a bit more on the technical side, but this is where we would set up certain security aspects about the directory, like how complex does the password need to be? How many password attempts are allowed? When do you want to email them about the upcoming expiration of their password? You can even choose certain things like the level of encryption that needs to occur for the password in the database. But in this case, we're going to leave everything at the default. And click continue. And that's it. So now when I go back to the directories column, you'll see this new directory that's there. A little later when we get into the user section, what I'll show you is actually a mass user import, which is really one of the more powerful features of Crowd that you don't have in Jira or any of the other tools, is that I can basically stage an Excel file and then upload it in just a matter of seconds and give everyone the right permissions that I want based on a staged file. So that's really it for directories. Now that I've created this, and we'll go into Jira in a minute and take a look at it, all this is syncing automatically about every minute with Jira and Confluence and Bitbucket to keep everybody's permissions up to date. So the next piece is going to be groups, which you guys will probably recognize this. So within each, when you install Jira initially or you install Confluence initially, there's some basic groups that everybody gets and that are available in the directory. Well, here what we're seeing is all those basic groups now brought into Crowd and in one place for me to manage. So you've got your individuals that use Confluence, and then your individuals that are actually administrators in Confluence, and a similar thing for Jira and Bitbucket. So this is really nice because now instead of, again, going into each application and making decisions about, which permissions to give different individuals, I can just click on these groups at a glance and see who's a member of each one. And then from here, I can also make those changes. So for instance, Confluence administrators, let's say I don't want Manohar to be an admin anymore. I can just click this X, and now that's automatically flown over into Confluence, and he's no longer an admin. Even this screen is a lot easier to work with than your typical Confluence directory screen. If you guys use something like that, you're probably used to actually having to go into each named user and then navigate through several screens to actually find a place to deactivate them. This makes user management at a in-mass level much easier to do, and navigating across the groups of members of all those applications. So groups is pretty self-explanatory. Let's go into the actual user section. So this is where if I wanted to provision access to someone new across any of these applications, or even I have like a mass import I want to do, then I would do it at this screen. And so you can see add user is basically a very typical form: email address, username, give them an initial password, first and last name, pick the directory they're going to be in, and then boom, they automatically have access to all the applications. But let's look at doing a user import, which is really helpful for that example that we were given earlier of, because so now we have this contracting engagement with, say it's 10, 20 folks. Their project managers give me a list of users to get added into the system. So I'm going to just import that file. So let's use this Atlassian importing tool. Oops, sorry, that was actually the wrong one. Let's go back to users here. We'll do an import. So the CSV importing. So let me just briefly show you all what this file looks like. It's exactly what you would imagine in an Excel file. You've essentially got in each column the different attributes about a user. So first and last name, the email address, and let me share my screen here. Sorry, I gotta share my entire screen with you guys. Here we go. So these are what the files look like. You basically just stage up two. This one on the left side rather, actually just contains who the users are. So in this case, we're just going to import two. And then the right table here shows, okay, what groups do I want to give these people? So you've got the username being that key field between the two. And so all I've done is place these files in the home directory on the server, just using a simple transfer. And then on the wizard itself, you can actually go in here and just say, okay, I'm going to import a file. We're going to put this in this new directory that we created earlier called contracting engagement. No, the passwords aren't encrypted to CSV, so there's nothing to do here. And then now I'm just going to tell it where the file is that I placed on the server. This is something you might have a Linux system admin do for you. It just takes a matter of 2 or 3 minutes. Tell it where the files are, and then now it's just going to walk me through mapping those headers that we saw that were in that Excel file. So in this case, you see, okay, username, it's telling me what the first value was. That checks out. That's definitely going to be the username. First name, obviously that's the first name, and so on. And also one of those columns there is actually setting that initial password, which is really helpful too. If you need to be able to communicate to your user base Okay, here's the password that I've assigned to you initially. And then of course in Crowd, we can go in and say, let's go ahead and make that expired. So when they first log in, they're forced to change it for the first time. Just click continue. It's asking me to just confirm, okay, you sure does this look okay? Say yes, there we go. So now it's telling me users have been imported. So it's created some groups there. And then the group memberships themselves have also been imported. So if I go into directories now, I should see, oops, sorry, users. And look at this contracting directory. Here's the 2 folks that we just added. So then our last tab is actually going to be the application section. So this piece is a little bit more technical and I won't go into great detail, but this is where you would actually add in the applications that you want to configure to work with Crowd. In this case, we've actually set up, Bitbucket Crowd, or sorry, Bitbucket Confluence and Jira. It even comes delivered with the Google Applications connector. So if you're using things like Google Sheets as a group, I forgot the other Google Office level Office level applications, but all of those are easily integrated with this. So you can use the same set of credentials to log into those. And then of course, adding an application, you just select on the left side. And then if you're using any of these Atlassian tools, it's a very simple wizard that walks you through. Probably takes 2 or 3 minutes to get connected. And then because those connectors are built for Atlassian, and then you've got a generic application tool which helps you build things like those OpenID integrations that we were talking about earlier that are widely used outside of the Atlassian ecosystem. So now if I go into, I just want to demonstrate kind of that single sign-on functionality. So I'm logged in now through Crowd, and this is me accessing our Jira instance. The really nice thing, especially if you're using 2 or more Atlassian tools, is now there's I'm never getting a prompt to relog in when I'm going between tools, which can happen pretty often as that token gets exchanged. So I'm in Jira, I can easily just click on Confluence, and you'll see that I'm still logged in here. And then the same with Bitbucket. So for the process of maybe creating an issue, writing a requirements page in the Confluence section, and then to the end at checking in code in Bitbucket, all that's much more seamless, and there's less, having to log in, but also sometimes having to manage different credentials if your directories are not really in sync between those applications. One big thing that comes up when we talk about authentication permissions is always multi-factor authentication. It's especially important now in sectors like government or healthcare, where you're dealing with HIPAA data. I believe that's actually a requirement now for multi-factor to be in place. Crowd out of the box does not have any multi-factor tools, but there are multiple add-ons depending on which authentication method you want to use. So Kerberos, Google, SAML Systems, Office 365, Microsoft Azure, LastPass are all tools that are out there and available, some of which are actually free to do the multi-factor authentication. A lot of that, can typically depend on what your enterprise security policy is. But in general, oops, I got checked by a message there. In general, you can pretty much meet any multi-factor need that you have, whether it's a bingo card or having to use a random number generator on an app. Those are all available to use with Crowd. That way you can place all these Atlassian tools and your OpenID tools behind that multi-factor